Hey folks, welcome to the Confucius video. I'm just going to go over now in this video the Confucian project, like what his goal was. You may have heard the name Confucius. I'm sure many of you have at least heard the name. It actually goes back to ancient China, and so that's where we're moving back to now. And it was so influential that even today in China, you can see all the different perspectives and worldviews, from the communism of the Chinese government to Buddhist influences to Taoist influences, who we'll talk about soon. But also Confucius was right back there and smack in the middle, and he has made an indelible mark on Chinese culture. And so, just some historical data was kind of interesting. Back in Confucius's time, 25% of the world's population lived in China, right? A quarter, 1 in 4 of every person that existed lived in that broad region we now call China. Today it's closer to 20%. So it hasn't changed that much, but just to show you that this is a choral world philosophy. Right? The ideas that originated there were influential not just to that 25% or 20% now, but throughout the rest of the world as well, but especially influential to those living at that time. So Confucius himself, the idea Confucius is kind of a westernized, Latinized version of what's usually, in Chinese would be Confucius, which basically means the Kong was his family name and Futsu meant master, great master. So he was the great master of the Kong lineage, of the Kong family. And Confucius was a political consultant, really. He would have been considered somebody who has worked in government, tried to advise various people, was well respected as a smart, intellectual person with good ideas. But like so many brilliant people in his time, he was not fully accepted. Right? He never quite had the opportunity to see his ideas implemented. He almost, like if you read the text, you'll see that he almost got connected here and there, and he had some high level connections, but mostly by and large, during his time, he was not listened to. He did have students though, and he was very influential to a more small group of people. So using the the terminology of today, he was a minor level, smaller level influencer. But among that group of people, he had very devout followers, and some of whom would write down the main book we have from Confucius called the Analects, which are like his sayings and his ideas. And much of the ideas we have from Confucius comes from that. As you'll see in the chapter, there are other sources as well, including Mencius, a follower of his later on. So I think it's interesting to talk about Confucianism in terms of, is it a religion or a philosophy? And really there's, yes, in a sense we could say yes to both. It really depends on how you define those terms, and I think it's an interesting conversation. But the sense in which it's not a religion is that when we think of a religion, we think of gods and heaven and hell and souls and some, kind of detailed cosmology. Confucius didn't really have that, and in fact, he was explicitly talking about human nature and human connection. And he was even, to some extent, dismissive of questions of the afterlife or what came before or what comes after. He said, we have to focus our human intelligence on the current scenario that we're dealing with, which is human life right now in the present, human interactions, human connection. So for that reason, he's sometimes called a humanist. It's a modern term. It's a similar idea where you focus in on the human existence and you try to better our lives now, and you don't worry about the afterlife and so forth. But it's kind of interesting because in a way, Buddhism falls into the same area where it's usually considered a religion, but there are Buddhists who follow just the Four Noble Truths part of Buddhism, where you just try to weed out the ego and the craving, as we talked about, and they don't really focus on the reincarnation parts. And so, in a sense, Buddhism can also be seen as a belief system, not a religion. But it really depends on how everybody practices it, and it depends on how it's defined. Now, going back to Confucianism and the idea of Confucianism being a religion, there is a case to be made that there's religious elements, because there's this term Tian, which often is translated as like the mandate or the mandate of heaven. Those of you who've studied Platonic philosophy or Plato will know the idea of the world of forms. Plato says that there are these forms, these kind of perfect forms or perfect ideals for everything we have in our life, including ideal of a triangle, of a perfect triangle, the ideals of love, the ideals of friendship. So in a way, there's a connection there with Confucius. When he says the mandate of heaven, he's saying there's this ideal of heaven and a mandate on our behavior where we have to behave virtuously and be kind to each other. And it comes from this higher ideal. Now, if you want to call that religious, you could, but Plato wasn't necessarily religious, although even that's debatable. But the point is that it's kind of similar, that Confucius is saying there's this ideal, this mandate that we have to follow. And so Confucius is really talking about the human world and putting the onus of making ourselves better on humanity. He talks a lot about what we would call today character, development of character, becoming a better person so that you can be a better person within your community, and that goodness can spread throughout your community. So, for example, in the West, when we think about learning music, learning instruments, it's often with kind of like an instrumental goal, isn't it? People want to play guitar so they can impress somebody else, or, I mean, they may generally want to learn, but they also want to have a band and they want to share their music with other people. They want to build a YouTube channel where they show their technical skills. Music in the West sort of exists always with this kind of instrumental aim. I shouldn't say always, but often. In Confucianism, learning an instrument or becoming better at even a skill beyond music would be about developing character or building character just for the sake of it, just so you're a better person for the people around you, right? So there's sort of an internal, intrinsic motivation, to use that language of psychology, and it's only later that there's this extrinsic goal, outside goal that leads to and betters other people. But the focus is on the development of the human from within. And so another way to say it is that Confucius is a bottom-up philosopher, not a top-down. He's a sort of type of activist, you could even use that term, where he wants to change society and change things, but sort of to return to a core way of being where we better ourselves and we work from ourselves from the bottom up, from within, and that has an effect on others without. Another analogy might be like, in a different way, the pebble analogy we talked about earlier. You're dropping the pebble in your own pond and you're making those ripples go out so that you become a better person, and that influences others around you to be a better person. And so, kind of interestingly, Confucius would be considered conservative politically by modern standards, because he explicitly said, he looked back at the ancients in his time, right? We're talking about thousands of years ago. He's ancient to us. But in his time, he's looking back hundreds of years at other Chinese philosophers and thinkers who sort of just had a natural, instinctive way of developing character and doing everything Confucius wanted. So Confucius explicitly said, we don't need to come up with new progressive ideas. He didn't want to revamp the government. He didn't want to pull a Karl Marx and institute communism, and overthrow capitalism or something like that. I mean, those terms didn't even exist yet. But he didn't want to make any wide-scale, serious change. He said, hey, the ancients are the people we look up to, have already discovered how to kind of better ourselves in a way that develops ourselves to have better character. They've already discovered it. Why reinvent the wheel? Let's use their ideas and apply them to the present and kind of go back to the way things were. So when I say conservative, I mean in the very broad sense of political conservatism. That wouldn't entail something like MAGA today, for example, or specific, more recent right-wing movements. But just the idea of being conservative, of kind of conserving the way things are done and have been done in society. And so Confucius was conservative in that sense. Now, just to kind of point out, many negatives that feminists and others, and even just society broadly would point to, things that are a little old-fashioned today, Confucius did think that, women had a certain role and men had a certain role. The male's role was more social, the woman's role was more in the household. So his ideas of conservatism did entail that everybody has this specific place to be in society. He included that with friendships. There were certain ways that friendships were supposed to play out, and friendships were supposed to help out both people, help them both develop their character in contrast with one another and with consistent with one another as well, to make the best of each other. And he would even say the relationship between man and wife, right? They both help enhance each other's roles. So this bottom-up philosophy is kind of Confucius's idea of bringing society back into the harmony that he thought was lost. Now, if you read the chapter, you'll notice that historically they were in a part of Chinese history sometimes called the Warring States period. So, as you can imagine, right, there were these kind of 4 or 5, actually I think it was more like 6 or 7 central city-states, and you can look at an ancient map of China to see this. And they're all fighting with each other, and there's a lot of people with authoritarian ideas who are trying to take over and say, I have the answer. And sometimes it's also called the period of 100 philosophers, because in response to all the turmoil and the fighting, different philosophers came up with different ideas of how to unite things again and how to bring things back to normal. And of course, Confucius was one of the most prominent of those philosophers. And his idea, as I've been saying, was to bring back the old ways, to be conservative, to follow the old ways, develop your character. One last thing I want to point out here that's important for Confucius is sometimes this idea, like it's there's not a direct translation, but it's translated as the word in Chinese is li in Mandarin, li, Li, and it often gets translated as kind of ceremony or custom. And so for Confucius, one of the best ways we bring people together, we have to develop ourselves and develop our character, like I said, but also we have to make sure that we're coming together as people. So to this day, there are many, many holidays throughout the year in China, and some of those are the kind of after effect of Confucius's philosophy. Because Confucius famously said that whatever the ceremony, I don't care what the original origin was, even if it was some sort of animal sacrifice, he famously said, we've got to continue with these ceremonies because they bring people together, and that's what continues this. That's how the mandate of heaven, the Tian, is realized. That's how we come together, is through this concept of li and ceremony and connection. So you kind of have to think about, in our culture, we'd say Thanksgiving or Christmas, in Western culture, where people come together and they come home from work, from college, everyone comes together and they catch up, and everybody's just kind of drinking and having a good time and talking and interconnecting. For Confucius, that's when the li is at play, right? But for Confucius, the li went beyond even ceremony into just good manners and treating other people with respect in public and opening the door for people and saying please and thank you and so forth. So for Confucius, a good society, he never thought it would be perfect. He always knew human nature would get in the way in some ways. But he said as long as everybody tried to develop themselves from within, develop good character, build good friendships, build good connections, have a good social environment and social glue, as long as we did that, Confucius said, things would be better. We'd go back to the old ways, in his opinion, when things were more humanistic, when people cared more for each other, when there weren't authoritarian tendencies that were dominant, when there wasn't a lot of ego. Right? So a lot of it is like, the Buddhists have this idea of releasing ego, and of course it's much deeper metaphysically, as we talked about, to completely disentangle the self. But here Confucius is sort of saying, we're always going to have some ego, but we got to put it to the side and bring the best of ourselves out so that we can build our ego in order to connect. We can build our character in order to connect, and not in ways that are dominant or dismissive of other people. Okay, so I hope that gives you a general sense of Confucianism. As we go on, we'll see more in-depth analyses of the different strands of Confucianism that came after him, and even some of the ways that Confucianism plays out today in modern China.